Good afternoon and welcome to Early Resolution, how strategic use of visualization and animation can help your client avoid trial. I'm Lori Critt Martin, the Vice Chair of the Beverly Hills Bar Association's litigation section. I'm a certified family law specialist. I'm very happy to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Charles Fox, who goes by Chuck. Chuck is the Senior Director of Client Development at Engineering Services Incorporated. After earning a doctorate at Ohio State University and completing a neuroscience fellowship at the University of Michigan, Chuck made a bold pivot in 1994, leaving academia to join a pioneering team focused on 3D animation and scientific visualization. What Chuck started as a temporary project blossomed into 3 decades of pioneering work at the crossroads of science, technology, and storytelling. Over the years, Chuck has guided the multidisciplinary teams in creating visualization tools that bring clarity to complex scientific ideas and shed light on unseen events. Assets that prove invaluable in mediations, arbitrations, and trials. We can't wait to see what he has to share with us today. Chuck, the floor is yours.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Lori. I realized in your introduction that 1994 sounds like a long time ago, and it doesn't feel like it was that long ago, but things have changed dramatically, and I'm going to talk about some of that today, especially in association with this technology that I'm going to share. So let's pop up my PowerPoint here, and I've managed to do it twice. Are you seeing my screen right now?
Yes.
Awesome. So I have a slide here called storytelling versus reality finding. And back in the early days, we talked about 1994, and if you go back to the 1990s and early 2000s for that matter, when we began creating 3D animation for the courtroom, we really viewed it as a storytelling tool. When engineers were testifying about cases in the courtroom, there were often complex topics. If it was a vehicle accident case, there were issues like braking, distance, and line of sight, and things like that that were really difficult to describe and sometimes not captured by fact finders. And using 3D animation as a tool for putting those concepts on screen, for putting fact finders in the driver's seat of a car or a witness view for an industrial accident or perhaps a crime scene was really valuable because these concepts really transcended the technical jargon that the expert was likely to use. So it allowed us to really teach these complicated concepts to really powerfully testify on their own. And we also learned that these are quite memorable, that in fact, when you put this kind of imagery in front of someone, they can often recall details from it much longer than they can recall details if they were to read about it or hear about it as part of testimony. So the tools had tremendous value at this stage as a storytelling tool, but they weren't necessarily reality finding tools. In some sense, I always bristled at the term cartoon, but in some sense at that stage, they were. Now, I think if you think about sort of 2015 is kind of a landmark year in my mind, it's somewhere in that region. Things began to shift toward reality finding. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by reality finding is really the tools that were used to collect data that we were building the animation in became very reliable. So before this time, most of the time at an accident scene, we relied on measurements that were made like you might imagine with a tape measure, a measuring wheel on a roadway, and perhaps a policeman's accident report or a drawing of an intersection that may or may not be accurate. In 2015, we started seeing laser scanners in the space, and we started seeing laser scan data on a fairly regular basis. And so instead of maybe a handful of measurements from a scene. We had millions of measurements from a scene, and they were accurate down to the millimeter. So we could understand the geometry of a scene in a high level of detail, and also it was highly reliable. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about kind of defining space as the first step. And this was the first step toward something I would call reality finding, that we could reliably take data and say, hey, we know this vehicle moved this distance in this period of time, and we know precisely what those distances were and what the details were about that particular scene. As you glean from the title of this presentation, this has a lot to do with the ability of these tools to help clients avoid trial, because rather than explaining something in the courtroom to a fact finder and having a cartoon to do it better, these started to become really reliable depictions of what happened in a particular event. And when we do that well, and the story is clear, it often can drive settlement early on in a case. So capturing space. Um, what do I mean when I talk about capturing space? Well, this is an example of the early days of capturing space. And this actually predates the laser scanners in 2015, but it was something we could do on a large scale. And what you're seeing on this screen is on the left side, you're seeing a grid, essentially like a piece of graph paper, but it's a complicated shape. It looks like it's draped over something. And in fact, what that is United States Geological Survey data for Mount St. Helens. So this is 3 meter data. So if you imagine a grid where the points are spaced by 3 meters, we have XY coordinates. So we know basically on a north, south, east, west grid where that point is located. And then we have elevation data, Z data, which tells us how high that point is. And when we know 3 points, we actually know where that point is in space. And if we put a bunch of them together, we can create a grid like this that is the shape of, in this case, Mount St. Helens. On the right, we have aerial photography from Mount St. Helens. And if we combine those two things, if we map that color data to the grid, we get a really nice 3D depiction of Mount St. Helens. And this is useful, for example, in an aviation case, if we had wanted to have an airplane flying by Mount St. Helens and have a view from the airplane, we've essentially got a digital twin of Mount St. Helens that we can look at from any vantage point that we desire. So that was some of the first sort of three-dimensional data we began to work with that had some kind of deep scientific basis in terms of being able to pull out data from North America. Laser scanning works on the same principle. We're capturing points that have X, Y, and Z values to them, but we're doing it at much higher detail. So I mentioned that the USGS data is captured at 3 meter intervals. The scanners that are on the screen right now capture data on inches to millimeter intervals, or in the case of the scanner on the right side of the screen that's in Nick's hand here, down to 40 microns spacing. So extraordinarily detailed data. On the left is a Faro scanner, and if you're a litigator and you've worked on like accident reconstruction cases, you've seen data from a Faro laser scanner. These are very common. Law enforcement uses them a lot. We have a fleet of them that we take into the field, and you can imagine sort of surveying a scene. Well, a surveyor is taking points one at a time. The Faro Focus takes points, millions at a time. In about a 6 minute scan, we get millions of points in a volume that's about 300 meters or so in diameter. So you can imagine having this large volume of points that are millimeter interval points. It's a pretty detailed description of a geometric space, perhaps where an accident occurred. The scanner that David's wearing, the guy in the red shirt, is a similar technology. It's a laser scanner. It's actually two laser scanners. There's one above his head and one in front of where his hands are that are oriented orthogonally. One's scanning horizontal and one's scanning vertically. And he can walk that scanner through a space. And so what's really handy about that is in a complicated space, he can capture like the interior of a building or industrial space fairly quickly by being able to move through it. The hand scanner I mentioned Nick is using captures very, very high detail data. So if we need a small area captured at very high detail, we would use a hand scanner, and we use those in the laboratory or in the field. And then finally, you can tell I added this one later. There are vehicle-mounted scanners now that allow us to scan roadways in fairly high detail. And what makes that really important is roadways are a dangerous place to scan, and often we can't shut down traffic. We might be at a scene, months after an accident happened. And one of the ways we can scan the roadway safely is by driving through it. And we can make multiple passes with a vehicle and capture a roadway in a fairly high level of detail. So this is what that data looks like. This is the picture on the right-hand side of this screen is a scan that David did in an industrial space. And you can see really what I'm talking about in terms of the level of detail. It captures not only XYZ information, but it also captures color information. So a term that I'll use is point cloud. And the point cloud just refers to the collection of these 3D points, each of them having XYZ information. And the point cloud is colored, so each of the points also has color information. So it gives a pretty good depiction of that three-dimensional space. One of the things I'll mention about this slide that you should be aware of too, in terms of when we collect data, we can use multiple forms of the scanner at the same time. So if you look in the background of this scan, if you look really carefully in the back right side of the scan, you see a Faro scanner in the background on a tripod. And that's because we scanned this space with both scanner types because we wanted a really high fidelity scan for this. And both scanners give us a different view on that data that increases its fidelity. This slide is showing data that was taken with a laser scanner that was on a drone. So we can actually fly laser scanners over roadways as well. And this is a roadway that was captured with a laser scanner. There can be challenges. We can't overfly roadways directly. We have to fly off to the sides for safety reasons. And if it was a really busy road, we would be very cautious about putting a drone up in those areas too. There can also be areas that we can't access for, with drones for a variety of reasons. So we would drive those in those cases. And so one of the things that you'll notice in this one, a little pro tip in the background, is you see in the lower part of this image of the roadway a checkerboard marker. It's a white and black checkerboard. And those are used because we can map very specifically with GPS tools where those markers are positioned. And then we can map this data back into, for example, USGS data or other terrain data or GS data that might be relevant to a particular case. So it allows us to combine data sets. And as you're going to see as this presentation proceeds, a lot of the secret sauce of really doing this well has to do with combining data sets. This is just a shot of a scanner in action. This is a Faro scanner. We're at this was a refinery fire, explosion and fire that happened. It involved a really large area of damage and destruction that we needed to capture. So you think about 3D models and where they come from. In scenes that are chaotic, like an explosion or a fire, laser scanners are invaluable because we can capture that 3D chaos in a really detailed fashion. And some engineering drawing or diagram of the refinery, while it might be great in telling us what the state of the refinery was before the explosion, if we want to know what it is after the explosion, we need to scan it. And in fact, we'll frequently do these scans sequentially. So as cleanup is occurring at an event like this and evidence is being um, unearthed in essence or revealed as a cleanup happens, we can actually capture that with scans that are going on day after day. This is what that data looks like when you scan, an entire area of a large scale thing like this refinery. This is just a small part of the refinery, but it involves hundreds of scans that are stitched together to get this particular point cloud. So it's not like we pop the scanner out there in a large scene once, push a button and walk away. There is some skill to choosing where you place the scanner so that your scans are overlapping and you're doing the right thing to capture this. But the super cool thing about this technology is once you have this XYZ plus color data, you can enter it. And you can go into the data and look at it from any vantage point that you wish, being, any scale that you want. So human scale is the most frequent one and the most important. And so here we are standing at the site of this explosion on a particular day of the cleanup, and we have everything precisely mapped in here. It's not just a picture. This is a 3D point cloud. So we can measure anything in here you want to measure down to millimeter accuracy. So if one of the experts decides, hey, I want to measure, how far this piece of debris was from this point of origin, we can do that for them. And if they want to do it 6 months or a year after they were boots on the ground, we can do that. We've got it on a server and we can pop it up and go back to that site again and again. When you saw that image, you sort of got a sense it's like VR, and we often go into it in VR. So this is just a movie in one of the labs in that data set. So we can put on a VR headset, we can get in that scene, and we can walk around it, inspecting it digitally, if you will. It's not interactive at this point. We can't go in and move things around, but we can certainly dive into that data and get a one-to-one view of it. So I'm going to take a breath at this point. I know Suzanne was screening questions. Are there any questions at this point? Are the slides looking okay? Technically, are we doing well?
Doing great. No questions so far.
Excellent. So what I'm going to do now is shift gears from kind of some of the background to a case study. So you can kind of understand how this all comes together and why it's so vitally important to capture that data up front and why I spent all that time telling you about it. So in this particular accident, it involved a powered concrete buggy. And so these machines, you may have seen them, they're sort of like a wheelbarrow if you put a motor and tracks on it, and you can move like big things that you couldn't normally move in a wheelbarrow, like big chunks of concrete or big rocks and things like that. And this was a site where landscaping was occurring, and they were tearing out a section of sidewalk at a location. And this worker was moving chunks of the concrete away from the construction site with this concrete buggy. They were loading the concrete then into a skid loader that then lifted it up and put it in the back of a dump truck. And so he was operating this powered buggy between the skid loader and the dump truck. And you can kind of see that in this image here. So typically, when my team gets involved, it's sometime after the accident occurred. Rarely are we there at the time of the accident. We're often there days, months, sometimes even years after an accident has happened. And so capturing the scene, while the value might diminish a little bit, what I'm going to show you is it's still absolutely vitally important and really valuable to capture the scene. So this illustration shows the collection of things that were put together to reconstruct the scene at the time of the accident. This is if you look up at the top left, you'll see something labeled B, site scan. And you recognize by now that's a point cloud. That is point cloud data from the day that we laser scanned the scene. And you see the dump truck isn't there, the skid loader isn't there, concrete buggy isn't there. In fact, there's a minivan parked where roughly where the truck was. That's okay. We've got a phenomenal set of 3D data here that we can work with to rebuild this scene. We, in fact, had to go to another site where the concrete buggy was stored to actually laser scan the concrete buggy, which we did. That's right here is C. D is the dump truck, and this is the actual dump truck that was involved in the accident. We were able to go out and scan that. It had been in use since the time of the accident, but it was unaltered from the accident itself. And then we actually had some manufacturer's data, just regular old engineering CAD for a skid loader. So we didn't have to really laser scan that. We could just put the skid loader that we had into this 3D scene. So we need a 3D scene that will actually depict the scene at the time of the accident. And that's the exercise we go through with all these objects, with the site scan being the key thing that's going to tie all these elements together. And you're thinking, well, Chuck, how do these things all tied together if you're there months later? The key is first responder photos or witness photos or surveillance video or this thing that's really ubiquitous these days. Everywhere we go, we're on camera. And in this particular case, first responders took 2 photos that were absolutely critical for us. And what you're seeing in this slide is on the left side of this slide is the skid loader. On the left side of the left side, A is the accident photo. This is the photo that the first responder took at the time of the accident. The right side on the right side of the slash on the left panel is the computer model of the skid loader that's now placed exactly where the skid loader was in the photograph. Similarly, there was a picture of the back of the dump truck with the victim of the accident on the ground. And the left side of that is the photo. The right side is the reconstruction of the back of the truck. The technique that's used is called photogrammetry. And what we can do is simulate the camera that took the photos in the computer, move the computerized camera to the exact location where the camera was that took the photo, and then take key points that we can identify in both the photo and on the model that are arrayed both in the X, Y, and the Z planes. So you want some things that are close to the ground, but you don't want all the things to be close to the ground. You want some of them to be raised in space to create the proper alignment for the skid loader in our reconstruction. Similarly, we did the same thing with the truck, and we could define the space then that existed between the truck where it was parked and the skid loader where it was parked. And that's using features from the photographs of the scene. Now we know the space that the concrete buggy was being occupied in, and we could begin to look at the injuries that our victim suffered and figure out how he became entangled between the concrete buggy and the truck. And in fact, the digital analysis allowed us to go back into the lab and build a physical scenario to sort of be able to interact with a real surrogate with the back of the truck and the concrete buggy to start to explore, how could this happen? How did this person get trapped between the concrete buggy and the truck? And we learned that what had happened was the space that was being operated in was a little too tight, really, for operating the buggy. The operator had successfully maneuvered it in this space a few times, and it could be successfully maneuvered, but the placards on the machine suggested that it should not be operated in such a tight space. And the other thing we learned that was interesting was that once the operator got pinched between the buggy and the back of the truck, their torso pushed on part of the mechanism that allowed them to release the drive system on it. And so the machine kept pressing them into the back of the truck, and they weren't able to stop that in a timely fashion to avoid injury. This view gives us a variety of those depictions. We could very accurately indicate where the truck and the skid loader had been located, even though we weren't there at the time of the accident, and those measurements weren't taken at the time of the accident. We could reconstruct it because we had this 3D scan that we could pull it all together with. We could show how one could maneuver the buggy, and you could tell from the previous images we figured out sort of what happened in this particular accident. This led to an early settlement in this case. The visuals really had a powerful way, I think, of shifting the conversation to what would have perhaps happened to a pretty discrete and narrow set of possibilities in terms of what happened. And, in many of these cases, this is kind of my personal reflection on these things, but you look at a lot of these cases and it does make you wonder, like, if we're thinking safety first, why didn't someone just move the dump truck ahead a little bit? Maybe there was a car parked on the other side of it. I don't know why, but it would have been relatively easy to create more space in this case. I mean, they were lifting this stuff up there in a skid loader, so you have to drive it 5 more feet. It probably would have changed this scenario. And I think these visuals are a powerful way, even for someone who may not be trained or have ever operated in a space like this, to imagine how something like this might have happened and what could have been done to prevent it. So capturing time is the next topic. The previous one, you noticed, like, there was no moving animation in that case. We literally used these 3D animation tools to let space reveal what likely happened in this case. The challenge about actually animating something is you need to now layer on the element of time. And what might be going through your head is, where do you get that? How do you understand time? Well, this is something we've all seen a lot of, not just a knucklehead mowing his lawn, because that's me just mowing my lawn here in Atlanta. But this is Ring camera footage. So, like it or not, my Ring camera captured me mowing on my front lawn. I didn't really know it at the time, but when I was preparing this presentation, I'm like, gee, I need some security camera footage that I can share. And like, well, here I am mowing my lawn. So this is how we can capture time. You can see very precisely, where I'm moving. The video has a time scale on it, but there are a few things that you should be aware of when you're thinking about using security camera footage. And they relate to how companies make this footage small enough to store it. So one is that the frame rates of these videos may not be consistent. So if you imagine 10 frames a second as a particular video, I'm just using that as a round number, then how things are moving, because in every frame it's 1/10 of a second. And so now you have this nice linear time scale associated with what you're seeing in the video. So if I wanted to measure how far I walked in a given period of time, if I knew it was 10 frames a second, that's a really easy calculation to make. However, most security camera footage, or much security camera footage, has a variable frame rate, because they don't really want to store a lot of frames where things aren't moving. And so you should be aware of that, because if someone who is working on this, a technologist working on this, has the original video, they can tell exactly what the frame rate is over any given second of the video. If we have a video that is an export, or is maybe recorded with a cell phone off the screen of something like this screen, we have no way to know what the original frame rate was in the video. And unless we see something that looks really anomalous, we may be mistaken in our interpretation of time. The other important information here is that this is a highly distorted image. So if you haven't looked, like, this pillar is curved, and you can see the rain spout on my house is like curving very extremely. I can tell you with confidence this pillar is not curved on my house. Similarly, at this side of the frame, you can see the exterior of the house here is bending. Like that's just a function of a camera trying to capture a really wide field of view. That can be corrected. But again, if we have the original footage, we know those settings. There's metadata associated with the frames that will help us correct it very easily. If we don't have the original footage, it's more difficult to correct and maybe less precise. How else can we capture time? Well, there are lots of things that happen that we can't see. And so, how do we capture time for something we can't see? Well, this is an example of using simulation to capture something we can't see. So, we might see the movement of this vehicle during an accident sequence. It might have been captured on a security camera. So, we know precisely how the vehicle moved, but we can't see the occupants in the security camera footage. And perhaps there's injuries that are allegations of something that went wrong with a vehicle or something. Well, we can use tools like simulation tools. This particular one is Matimo that allow us to simulate the occupant's motion in the vehicle and may give us some sense through an expert's interpretation of what the movement was of the occupants during an accident sequence. So again, I've kind of gone on about some pretty technical things. Any questions so far, Suzanne?
No questions just yet.
Okay, cool. Well, we are going to switch back into case study mode. And I want to tell you about a case where we sort of put this all together, right? We're going to collect our X, Y, Z data, and we're going to put time into play. There's another element that I'm going to layer into this one that's also particularly fun because it has a lot to do with this particular case and why it resolved early. And that is a big word called conspicuity. I love saying it because it makes me sound smart, but it really means what you could see. Like, what was someone able to see in this particular circumstance? And it's critical in this case. So I mentioned a couple caveats to security camera footage: frame rate, lens distortion. Another caveat is many security cameras are designed to see better than human beings can see. They have the ability to see better in low light conditions. They can see better, so they can see scenes better at night and things like that. And so when we evaluate this information, we can't always say, oh, well, you can see this in the security camera footage, so this person should have easily seen that. You have to consider what human perception would be like. And there's a very rigorous way to analyze a scene and its lighting with special photography and special targets that are used to determine what the human eye could see in a given scenario. And I just want to give you a heads up, that's embedded in this case study, and we can talk about that a little bit too, and kind of how reliable that is. So in this particular case, it involves a bus that struck a pedestrian at an intersection. This image is actually partway through the animation. It shows the bus's approach to this particular intersection. And I'll just kind of share an interesting anecdote about this because I live in Atlanta now, and this accident actually happened in Atlanta. But at the time this accident happened and the time we were doing all the analysis of the data, I lived in Ames, Iowa. And that's where our visualization team is located, where the majority of that kind of work happens. And this particular case was being worked on. So I had sort of been virtually in this intersection many, many times as this animation was developed, and we were consuming the data and putting it all together. This case resolved years before I moved to Atlanta. I moved 5 years ago, and I'm a cyclist. I love biking around the city. And one Saturday I was out on a ride and I rode into this intersection totally randomly, unbeknownst to me. And it was the weirdest experience I think I've ever had in an interesting way, because it was this deja vu that couldn't have been. Like, I've never been here before. I've never been on this side of the town. And yet I'm riding into this place that I know. It was also really satisfying because I was like, wow, this, when I figured out why I was having this deja vu, it was like, like look, I know this data is really reliable, but wow, it's like really reliable in this interesting human tangible way. And so this one kind of has this personal context to it that many of these end up having, when we work on them in this way. So I digressed. What do we do first? Well, the first thing we want to do is capture space, right? It's really important that we understand the space at a high level of detail. And so these are like the refinery I showed you, the outcome of a series of laser scans where we positioned laser scanners up and down these streets in both directions to capture information that we needed to understand the bus's approach to the intersection, things beyond the intersection, and things in either direction to the sides. For your orientation, the bus was actually coming from really the top center of this screen down through to the bottom left-hand side of this screen. So it was passing down this Ralph David Abernathy is the name of the street. The intersecting street is Lee Street. This is now looking again back up the street. So the bus would be coming toward us in this particular view. And again, this is our view of the intersection. One of the things that was really crucial in this case, because we knew it was going to be, that nighttime visibility was going to be really important in this case, was that our scan captured all the light sources in this scene. It was nighttime. And so much of the illumination in this intersection was going to be street lights and storefront windows and things like that. So we needed to capture all the light sources in the scan so we could very accurately place light sources in those fixtures. This is just a little closer look at the intersection. The crosswalk that the pedestrian is going to walk on in this particular screen is going to go from the right side of the screen to the left side of the screen across. You can see the whole crosswalk there. And again, the bus is coming toward us in our direction. And then finally, in this view of the scan, you're looking down the street kind of from the bus driver's perspective. This is what the approach to that intersection would have looked like from the perspective of the bus. And the elevated thing that you see in the distance is actually a railroad. The MARTA line actually runs across on the first bridge, and there's a freight train line that runs across a second bridge that crosses the road. I mentioned before, sometimes we source things from other things than laser scans. And in this particular case, we often use a hybrid approach where we scan the bus, but then we buy a model that might be commercially available that is that bus, and we just make sure that it's dimensionally accurate and that everything's positioned the way that it was on the bus that we have access to. Because you can imagine with a visibility case, we're going to be really worried about anything like side view mirrors, things that might have blocked the driver's point of view. We want to make sure we have those positioned in the 3D bus exactly as they were on the bus that was involved in the accident. Similarly, there are human models of a variety of sources, and there are tools that allow us to build those models in a scalable fashion. So once we have information about folks involved in the accident, to the extent we have information on them, we can actually build a dimensionally accurate model. In the case of conspicuity, we want to also make sure clothing, if there's any reflective properties to the clothing, colors of clothing, things like that, that we have that right. So again, security camera footage is going to be really important to us. And one of the things about city buses is they are bristling with security cameras, or buses have cameras all over them. And so we have, in this case, 4 of the cameras. There were at least 9. I can tell from the layout here. This is the forward-looking camera on the bus. The one to the right is actually a camera that's focused on the bus driver. The lower camera is looking at the front entry door, and then there's a camera on the outside of the bus looking back down the side of the bus along the side. I'm not going to show the video. It's a little bit graphic, but but what this gives us is a record of the bus moving down the street. And initially there were witnesses that said the bus was speeding, it was driving erratically. There were a number of allegations about the bus's movement. That was actually really straightforward to pin down with this video. So we knew exactly how fast the bus was moving because we could move it frame by frame through the 3D scene using this video footage. We could tell the path of the bus. In fact, we were even able to track the driver's behavior because of the camera that was focused on the driver. So I'm going to show you, this is a top-down view. So this would be a typical orienting animation that we would use to help viewers just begin to digest the scene, like what happened that night on Ralph David Abernathy. So couple things that are additive here that you should understand. So the bus is on the left side of the screen here. Before I put this in motion, I want you to notice that there are the two triangles coming out of the front of the bus that are kind of weird. Those are depicting the driver's field of view. And so we have high acuity of vision when it comes to our foveas, a specific part of our retina that's very sensitive. So this is showing in red the field of view that would have been high acuity for the driver. And then the blue triangle is showing the field of view, which we would call parafoveal. It has less acuity than the foveal view. The other thing you're going to notice in the readout is at the top, there's a time to impact and then the speed of the bus. The speed limit on this chunk of roadway, if I'm recalling rightly, I think is 35 miles an hour. The bus was never even really close to the posted speed limit as it approached this intersection. So I'm going to put this in motion. Oh, the other thing I should mention before I do that is the orange or the yellow circles they're on here are circling pedestrians. There were other pedestrians out there, but from the experts' analysis of the head movements of the driver, these three were particularly important to the driver's attention. And it's the pedestrian that's in the crosswalk that will be struck. So here we put the bus in motion. We're seeing where the driver's attention is. And you see at the very last second, the driver's attention focused on the pedestrian that he struck. And you kind of wonder why, because that pedestrian was really the one that was really out in front of the bus, right? Why was so much attention focused on this other pedestrian? Well, when you approach this intersection, it's important to understand from the driver's point of view that that the lighting is really interesting. There's oncoming traffic at this particular intersection, and the way the street is laid out, the oncoming traffic's actually kind of coming up a slope to this stoplight. So the headlights are particularly blinding because they're really pointing more toward your eyes. In this animation, we're going to show the same sequence from the bus driver's point of view. So now the triangles are circles. And so the red circle represents the high acuity vision and the blue circle represents the lower acuity vision. And we're going to be able to see where the driver's attention was focused as he approached the intersection. The other thing I want you to pay attention to simultaneously is the visibility of the pedestrian that's in the crosswalk. I'm going to give you the clue. You're going to know she's there, but imagine not knowing she's there and where your attention might be as you approach this intersection. And note that the light is green. The pedestrians do not have the right of way in this particular case. So that's the sequence from the bus driver's point of view. And I think oftentimes the power of 3D animation and this type of visualization is not so much the diagrammatic interpretation like the first one I showed you that was top down. That's really helpful in getting viewers aligned with what we're talking about and what really happened in this scene. But when you can then take all that data, we know how the bus moved, we know where the driver's head was moving, we know the lighting for the scene, we know that the geometry of it is precise, and we put you in that driver's seat and you can experience from that driver's point of view, it is really influential when it comes to resolving matters like this one. Any questions so far? Suzanne, are we so far so good or interesting questions popping up?
I just had one question pop up actually.
Mm-hmm.
Alexander Ginsberg asks, how much approximately did the 3D animation cost in the bus case?
So in the bus case, the total cost of creating that animation, as I recall, was around $65,000, I think, was spent by that client. And I throw that big number out there, but it doesn't happen that way. So, and the reason I say that is it happens in stages, and the team, the legal team, makes a lot of choices along the way. So the first thing we do when we're called into a case like this, and we sort of begin to understand it, is very likely we're going to go out and do a laser scan. When we do that laser scan, what I showed you a few images, what we would typically do is sit down with the client and look at the laser scan and go through all that data and kind of figure out, like, kind of maybe we even get in VR and we kind of come down the street from the perspective of the bus and we start to see what's going on. And we know it's nighttime. We maybe have photographs from the scene. You start to piece together what's going to be important. That phase of it is less than $10,000 to do that part. Depends on the complexity of the scene. It depends on a few things. But it can be anywhere from, $3,000 to $10,000 to get that view. And oftentimes it's at that stage where we're deciding, should we move ahead, or, is this something where we want to go in a different direction? And then the next step would be to start layering in. Well, let's get a scan of the bus. Maybe that's really important to look at. Maybe there's something obstruct. Maybe the windshield was damaged on the bus, or there's something about that. So we begin to look at different questions, pieces at a time. So it ends up being a series of bites at removing uncertainty and knowing more that ultimately gets us to a visual like this. And usually once we're at the point of going down the road of really rendering a visual that we're going to put out in front of maybe the opposing counsel or for a mediation or that kind of thing, we have a pretty good sense of what our story looks like in the case. So I hope that's responsive. That's always kind of it's an interesting question because I think there's sometimes sticker shock at the price, but it sort of happens over time. And that's a really important factor. Any other questions, Suzanne?
Not seeing any other questions just yet.
Okay. Well, I'm going to do another case study where we layer in another piece of knowing. And in the previous one with the bus, you might have noticed that the pedestrians were a little bit robotic. Maybe they weren't moving as smoothly as others. And that case is from a long time ago when we didn't have the technology we have at our fingertips now. And one of the really interesting technologies, really important technologies that we leverage when it comes to understanding how humans interact with the environment is human motion capture. And this has been used in the movie industry for a long time. It sort of needed to reach, it needed to cover a couple things. It had to get to a place where we could do it out in the real world for it to be particularly valuable for us. And it had to get to a space where it was also affordable enough that we could deploy it in cases where it scaled properly. So that happened. We now have a human performance lab in our office in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but we also have motion capture suits that can go anywhere. And so I'm going to show you this particular case. Now I'm going to warn you that in the security camera footage I'm going to show you, you are going to see a runner get struck by a vehicle. I will tell you she survived. She had injuries. if that's troubling to you, just don't watch for a little bit here. I will tell you when that has passed. It's not like she breaks into a million pieces or anything, but it is kind of violent. So this is the point where you might want to look away. I'm going to tee this up. This is security camera footage that's on a building that houses a gym. And this particular footage, I'm going to play it now. You'll see a jogger in the street back behind the trees. So you see her pass between the trees, and then you see this vehicle approach, and it strikes her, throwing her into the street. The vehicle was animated, like we covered up the vehicle just to protect the party in this particular case. So, okay, now you can look back. All the violence will be only animated at this point. This gives you a map of the layout of this scene. You'll recognize it immediately as a laser scan. This is a scene like everything else I've shown you where we went out and immediately scanned the scene. The building where the camera was mounted is right at the bottom of the screen, and you see we've marked the security camera location here. The interesting thing about this case is these two trees, the tree to the left actually blocked our view of the actual vehicle striking the jogger. But it's amazing how data can get pieced together. And because if you watched it, you saw the kind of how the vehicle threw her, kind of how she rode a little bit on the hood, the vehicle threw her, where she landed. All of that is dictated by the laws of physics. And so the throw distance and a number of these things help us map where things happened and with how much force and how fast things were going. So all of these little pieces in that security camera footage are clues that help us piece this back together. We've got the scene. We can also, because we have the 3D scene, we can accurately map the vehicles and the pedestrians back onto the scene in 3D. So if you imagine, we take a scale model of the vehicle, a scale model of the pedestrian, and by matching frame by frame, we can figure out what their path was on the roadway, even though that's kind of hard to discern when you're just looking at the video itself. When you take it all apart, and then put it back into the 3D model, these locations can be remapped. To lay out the scenario for you so you understand the sequence a little better, at this gym, part of what some of the folks were doing was a timed run, and they would go out from the gym and they would run 2 laps where they would run up this roadway to somewhere in this neighborhood. They would come back. You can see the jogger's path here coming up this way. When they reached this mailbox, they were supposed to turn left, cross this crack in the driveway, and then they would either go out for a second lap, or if it was their second lap, that was their time when they crossed this. So she's coming back along this roadway, getting ready to turn into this driveway, totally unbeknownst to us or anybody until we talk to people at the gym. So this is a view. This is a drone photo of the accident scene or the site where the accident happened. So this gives us an overhead view. You can see the security camera footage on the building here. And then the picture on the right is the laser scan of this particular scene. So we know a lot about this scene, but what we really wanted to do was really capture some accurate human motion. So we employed a physical surrogate. This is a person who's about the same size as the runner that was struck that day. And this is a video that I'm going to show you of a motion capture run. So she is wearing a Lycra suit that has 17 accelerometers embedded in it. And they're embedded in the various segments of her body. So it's actually measuring the movements of 17 different locations on her body. So what we did was painted markers on the ground that we could tell from the video footage where the runner's feet landed. And we asked this runner to run back over the footsteps of the accident runner. This is what that data looks like. This is just the output from the software itself. So there you can see her run now digitally. Each of those kind of chunks of her body represents the segments that are measured by the accelerometers. Cool thing about this data, I'm going to show you how it informs animation, but it also is capturing forces, accelerations, all kinds of things on every one of the 17 segments of her body. So a biomechanics expert can go in, we can reenact things and ask, gee, what were the forces on this person's, thigh bone when they were doing this particular activity? So now I want to show you, keep in mind, we did not animate the runner's motion based upon the runner in the video. We animated the runner's motion based upon the simulation that we did with our surrogate runner. So here's a frame of the security camera footage where you can see the runner that was struck. And here's a frame of the animation with our surrogate runner passing through that same space. Now here's the animated frames. And what I'm going to show you now are the animations that were used to settle this particular case. I will tell you now, you're not going to see the throw. So this is less violent. The impact is going to happen behind this tree. And, we don't really care about what happened after the impact in terms of the animation. It was useful in figuring some things out about the dynamics of this accident. So this is not going to appear as violent as the video did. So this is the animation. Our runner is going to pop into the frame here between the trees, and then here comes our truck, and the accident occurs. Truck magically rolls through without the runner. This viewpoint is from the view of the security camera footage, and it's got a purpose. It's, I think, really important to show the viewers that we have accurately reconstructed what happened in the security camera footage in this 3D environment. So this is sort of maybe a confidence builder. It really lends integrity to all the work that's gone into this without having to just brag about all the work that went into this. This is now our top-down view, like you saw in the bus scene, and you can see the vehicle approaching, and then all of a sudden the runner makes this hard left turn at the mailbox in front of the vehicle. Another point of view, again, because we've got this accurate depiction now, we can show as many points of view from any angle that you want to see it. There's the strike. And then again, kind of like the bus, I think the one that is really important is the driver's view from the vehicle. So she's running along the shoulder, the driver starts to move over to pass, and then she makes this hard left right in front of the vehicle. Our experts that analyzed this from beginning to end, it concluded that the driver really didn't have an opportunity to avoid this particular accident, that when the first clue sort of came that the runner was going to move into the path of the vehicle, when you look at reaction times and things, there was just not enough time to respond to the runner. I'm going to talk for the last 2 minutes here about virtual reality. I'm going to just compress it a little bit because I mentioned earlier how we use it in this context, like early on, looking at data, getting the entire team aligned around data that we've collected and what maybe we should do next, like both from the logical standpoint, like what should we do? But the question was asked earlier about budget from a budgetary standpoint. If we're limited in terms of a budget going forward, what's the most important thing we can do next given the budget? And so I think that's really important to entertain as well. So early on is important, but we also use it late in the game. Especially in cases like this. This is a mid-air collision that happened between a helicopter and an airplane at an airport on the East Coast. And in many of these cases, we know a lot. We know where the aircraft moved, but we don't necessarily know where the crew was looking. They usually don't survive these things. And so what we can do is put professional pilots in the seats of these aircraft and ask them where they should have or would have potentially been looking in the course of an accident like this. In this particular case, I'm looking at the oncoming aircraft. There's a variety of reasons to believe in this analysis of we can understand why they possibly overlooked this particular aircraft. But in this case, we can pipe in the air traffic control audio, any kind of cockpit conversations if there was a cockpit voice recorder, and time that all up, which is super valuable for an expert that's going to testify on piloting issues. And finally, this is a pedestrian that was struck by a train. And again, we often use VR to try to evaluate, like, what information did this pedestrian have access to once we reconstruct all this? And so this person obviously didn't see this train coming and was struck by it. They thought that the alarm was going off for the other train. But this gives us real human insights. Instead of spreadsheet after spreadsheet of data, we can take people in and have real human insights on these kind of events. So I hope this was helpful. At minimum, I hope it was interesting. And I'm happy to hang around for a while and entertain questions if you have them.
Right. Sorry, excuse me, Dr. Fox. It looks like we don't have any questions at the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you, so much for your attention. This has really been fun.
This concludes today's presentation. Thank you so much, Chuck, Dr. Fox, for your time today, and thank you so much to our audience. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.